This morning, I want to address the very difficult question of what we need to know about theology and abortion. Most of us know a draft opinion from the Supreme Court became public 2 weeks ago, and since then we learned that the majority of justices had privately voted to strike down Roe v. Wade. And since then, we've heard many legal, moral, legislative, and even medical opinions. But what do these events mean to us as people of faith? Now, I definitely don't pretend to have all the answers on this, or to even really understand the issues in the way that I might. But I hope that by sharing my own struggles and questions about this issue, that it might be helpful for you as you come to your own theological conclusions. Old Puritan sermons used to have a 3-part structure. The first part was called the text on the doctrine. On the text, it was about the biblical scripture readings. The second part was called doctrine, and it was about the ideas that arise out of those readings. And the third part was application, how it applies to our ordinary life. So I'm going to begin with the text. John of Patmos was living in exile, and he had a vision. He had an idea of what all creation is striving for. It's the ultimate big picture. He imagines that all creation is striving for a new heaven and a new earth. And then he adds a puzzling phrase, "And the sea will be no more." Now, when I mentioned this at the 8:30 service, someone started laughing because they know how much I like to surf, and a new heaven and a new earth without surf just they thought would be too disappointing for me. And people ask me this question quite often: what does this mean? And Karl Barth, the great theologian in the 20th century, he had this idea that the Old Testament had, when it referred to the sea or to the ocean, it was talking to a chaotic realm, a realm of powers that are kind of beyond the element of God. But my friend Herman Waitchen, the New Testament scholar, explains this in a way that I find much more compelling. He says that there's such a thing as the order of separation. That order of separation, that is what divides us from them. It stands for why we experience life as opposition and conflict against others, rather than as an experience of unity and harmony. God moves us toward the intimacy our hearts long for. God helps us to overcome the order of separation. Now, this morning we have 2 other stories. You're not really supposed to preach about all 3, but I couldn't resist. The 2 other stories have to do with Peter and with his confrontation with the order of separation. Now, unlike the other Gospels, in the Gospel of John, the last story of Jesus' last night with his disciples isn't primarily about the meal that they share together. It's not really about the Eucharist. There's 2 long narrative speeches in there, but the whole story is really about a single action that's so easy for all of us to understand. Jesus took off his shirt and he kneeled in front of his students and he washed their feet. Now, Peter, you'll remember, resists this. He says, "No, Lord, I should be washing your feet." And in a way, he's representative of all of us, because Jesus' act, it upsets our expectations. It upsets our values, our sense of hierarchy, our sense of decorum, our sense of what is pure and what is clean. Jesus explains that this way of dignifying another person is how God is glorified. It is how we build bridges to others, how we overcome the order of separation. Now, finally, we have Peter's dream. Peter, his whole life, was convinced before this that following Jesus was something that only Jews should do. And then he had that dream of the sheet being lowered from heaven with all 4 corners and the unclean animals. And the voice says to him, "Take and eat." And he says, "I've never had an unclean thing pass my lips." And the voice repeats to him this phrase, What God has made clean, you shall not call profane. So God invites Peter to move beyond his preconception and to begin to share meals with Jews and non-Jews, and to recognize those non-Jews as holy. And Peter so memorably says at the end, "Who was I that I should hinder God?" So how do we approach abortion in the spirit of overcoming the order of separation, in the attitude of someone kneeling to wash the feet of another person, in a world where God is challenging our vision of what is clean and what is pure? One of my best friends from Harvard was a young theologian named Matt Bolton, who his work continues just to inspire me all the time. And a great deal of what I say in the rest of the sermon borrows from his thought on this matter. Matt reminds us that whenever we begin this conversation, it should always come out of an attitude of empathy and respect. He begins by saying that life is precious. And this week, I went and I looked at all the references in the Bible to the word womb. And most of these, they convey an aura of intimacy and mystery and holiness. And we can understand why people might believe that human life begins at conception. Through history, some great Christian teachers have taught that abortion is morally unacceptable. My friend Matt writes about this. To believe on Christian theological grounds that in certain circumstances abortion is wrong is a conviction worthy of respect. But there is more. Life is precious, and a pregnant person's life is precious too. And human dignity, it naturally involves the freedom to determine our own future. Jesus does not say anything about abortion or about reproductive health. And the Bible includes many passages that seem to suggest that human life begins when we take our first breath. It also includes passages that distinguish between the well-being of a pregnant woman and that of a fetus. Great theologians such as St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas have taught that abortion is not homicide in the early stages of pregnancy. And so, to believe on Christian grounds that human beings have the right to have an abortion is also a conviction worthy of respect. Now, part of what makes our life holy, what makes us precious, is the sanctity of our own conscience. This freedom to decide for ourselves as we seek answers to the most personal and mysterious questions that we encounter as human beings. And this is especially the case when it comes to matters in which reasonable, thoughtful, and faithful people can disagree. What greater mystery is there than our own existence? What bigger question is there than when does life begin? When does one become two? These questions are so great, and there are so many other ones too. What other criteria should matter in making this important decision? Should we take into consideration sexual violence or incest? Should not the age, the mental health, and the physical health of the mother be considered in this matter? And what about other life circumstances, such as the way that poverty constricts our options, depletes our human dignity, when we have no power over our own lives? Now, these are such profound questions, and every situation is different. It is not a simple matter that can be easily and permanently resolved once and for all. Each person has to decide. And no one should be coerced to deviate from their conscience. No one should be coerced to deviate from their conscience, because this is where we meet the Holy One. This is where we meet God. Matt writes about the conviction of the founding fathers that God does not impose orthodoxy on us by force, and we should not impose our own opinions about orthodoxy on others. Force should have no place when it comes to matters of belief and conscience, especially on such personal, complex, and profound matters. In 1967, a group was convened, a group of clergy, and they formed to be able to help women to have more access to information and more access to affordable and safe abortion. And the group was called the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion. And they had chapters in 38 states. There are 3,000 clergy involved. And their mission was so simple: to offer compassion. To offer compassion. That's it. And they did this. This was their ministry, not despite their faith, but because of it. Now, even though 50 years have passed since Roe versus Wade and since the Clergy Consultation was founded, I think that the crucial issue that still is at stake is compassion. Compassion for people who view these matters in a different way than we do. Compassion for people who make different decisions than we would make. But above all, we need to show compassion for women who have been faced with terribly painful and difficult decisions in the past. And above all, for those who are vulnerable, afraid, or lonely today. Is there a way for Christian people to overcome the order of separation? To kneel before them and tenderly wash their feet? My last section is relatively shorter. Compassion needs to be our guide as we try to understand what to do about abortion, but it also should direct us in almost everything else that we do. Psychologists point out that we are constantly making comparisons with other people. We're constantly asking the question subconsciously of whether they fit in our group. We just do this by nature. But we have a chance to know and be smart about how we respond to this subconscious impulse. And this is part of the reason why abortion is such a difficult issue. It's so much more complicated than it seems on the surface, because it is related to how we understand ourselves, how we fit in with others, how we belong. Brene Brown, in her book, recognizes this. Her book is Atlas of the Heart. And she says that while it is natural to compare and sort people by identity, she believes it is so important to pay attention to how we respond to these observations. And one example she gives is a lovely one. She talks about the German word Schadenfreude, which is one of my favorite words because it identifies such a deep part of human life. Schadenfreude is taking joy in someone else's misfortune or suffering. We all know what that means. During COVID, we saw it so often, didn't we? When we would read newspaper articles about someone who was famous or had taken a public position on COVID, and then they'd become sick. At a deep level, Schadenfreude is fundamentally unchristian, and it comes out of our own insecurity. Many of you have heard this idea before, but there's another thing I want to share with you, and that is Brene Brown talks about an experience which she calls Freudenfreude. And Freudenfreude is the ability to take joy in the joy that other people are experiencing. This is the opposite of Schadenfreude. And Brene Brown writes that lack of Freudenfreude can fundamentally undermine our relationships. That we all need someone who will rejoice in the things that we rejoice in. And she pictures this when she describes it to children as putting out your hands flat and imagine your flame in the middle of your hands, and this is how you go. And she says, watch out for the people who try to blow your flame out. Stay away from those people. And she said, instead, seek out the people who are going to cup their hands around your flame so that the wind won't blow it out. Abortion is such a complicated issue. And this mystery about the beginning of life has come to be surrounded by such fear and anger in our time. But the world needs you right now. So this week for homework, I want you to explicitly seek out moments when you can offer up your own Schadenfreude, when you can cup your hands around someone else's light to help stop it from being blown out. Life is precious. How do we overcome the order of separation? How will we dignify another person's soul as if by kneeling before them and washing their feet? How is God inviting us to move beyond our preconceptions into a mysterious new realm of love?